The notebook trembled in Adaku's hands as her eyes traced the words written in bold, obsessive strokes. My queen, no one can take her from me. Father must go. Her word, carefully constructed over 15 years of devoted motherhood, began to crack like thin ice beneath her feet. But to understand how a mother's love twisted into something so dark, we must return to where it all began. 10 years of emptiness had carved deep lines of desperation in Adaku's heart. Each month brought renewed hope, followed by familiar disappointment. In the corners of family gatherings, her mother-in-law, Mama Chichi's whispers, slithered like venomous snakes. A barren woman is like a withered tree. The words stung, but Adaku held on to her prayers like a drowning woman clutching a lifeline. Then came the miracle. The day Jill was born, the hospital wards seemed to pulse with Adaku's joy. As she cradled a son for the first time, watching his tiny fingers curl around hers, she made a silent vow that would eventually become her undoing. Nothing will ever hurt you. Nothing will ever come between us. Mama Chiki's mocking smile turned sour as she watched Adaku parade her newborn at family gatherings. The other women cooed and praised, while Adaku's heart swelled with vindication. See, God has answered. Your words mean nothing now, but victory, when savored too sweetly, can blind one to the poison it might contain. Upon returning home, Adaku gathered her household staff in the living room. Her voice, usually gentle, carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. Listen carefully, she commanded, her arms wrapped protectively around sleeping Jill. This child is my miracle. Anyone who mishandles him, anyone who makes him cry, anyone who so much as looks at him wrongly, will leave this house immediately. The staff exchanged glances, sensing something unusual in their mistress's intensity, but they nodded their agreement. Little did they know they were witnessing the first threads of an obsession beginning to weave itself into the fabric of this household. As days melted into months and months into years, Adaku's devotion to Jill grew like a beautiful but invasive vine, slowly choking everything in its path. She noticed every detail about him, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, how his small hands reached for her constantly, the particular pitch of his cry that meant he wanted her and only her. And Chiye, Adaku's husband, watched this growing attachment with increasing unease. A successful businessman, he spent long hours at work, providing for his family, but when he was home, he couldn't help but notice how his 3-year-old son would scream in protest if Adaku so much as sat too close to him on the couch. A chick that stays too long under its mother's wings. Forget how to fly, he warned one evening, watching Jill throw another tantrum when Adaku tried to have a private conversation with him. Adaku merely laughed, the sound tinkling like wind chimes in a storm. He's just showing how much he loves me. Don't be jealous, my husband. But beneath her light words lay a deeper satisfaction. See how he loves me? See how he chooses me above all others? Gushimu corrects me, Bini. He wrung your eyebrows and twisted his hats positively above your eyes. The household staff saw it too. They watched as young Jill refused to play with other children, preferring instead to follow his mother like a shadow. They noticed how he would press himself against her leg when visitors came, his small face twisted with possession. Some tried to warn her, only to find themselves searching for new employment the next day. What no one could see, not even Adaku herself, was how each dismissed warning, each ignored red flag, each moment of blind indulgence was laying the foundation for something far more sinister. Like a master weaver working on the wrong side of a tapestry, Fate was creating a pattern that would only become clear when it was too late to unravel. And in the quiet moments of the night, as Adaku lay in bed with Jill curled against her side, because he refused to sleep alone, the seeds of future darkness were already beginning to sprout, nourished by the very love that was meant to protect him. What Adaku saw as devotion, others recognized as dependency. What she interpreted as love, they identified as obsession. But wrapped in the warm cocoon of her maternal satisfaction, she remained blind to the warning signs flashing like red lights in the growing darkness. After all, how could a mother's love ever be wrong? The answer to that question would come years later, written in the pages of a hidden notebook, penned by hands that had once reached for her in innocent need, but now grasped with a very different kind of hunger. Ohonge time, that relentless sculptor of fate, carved new patterns into the household's daily rhythms. As Jill grew from toddler to child, the invisible threads binding him to Adaku didn't loosen. They grew stronger, twisted, transformed into something that made the household staff exchange worried glances when they thought no one was watching. The first incident that made even Adatu's heart skip a beat came during bath time. She had always bathed Jill herself, dismissing the nanny's offers with a wave of her hand. No one else can do it right, she told herself. No one else knows how to make him comfortable. But on this particular evening, as steam clouded the bathroom mirrors and Jill's innocent questions about her body hung in the humid air, something shifted in the atmosphere, a subtle change, like the first tremor before an earthquake. Yet Adaku pushed the unease aside, just as she had pushed aside every warning sign before. When Jill began asking to shower with her every day, she saw only devotion where others might have seen the first glimpses of something troubling. The staff's whispered concerns were met with immediate dismissal, literally in the case of the maid, who dared suggest that perhaps a boy of his age should have more privacy. Gigi watched this all unfold from the periphery of his own home, feeling increasingly like a stranger in his child's life. His attempts to bond with Elle were met with cold resistance or outright hostility. During dinner times, when he tried to share stories from his day, Jill would deliberately interrupt, demanding his mother's attention with an intensity that made the air thick with tension. "Mama, come look at my drawing," he would call out, right in the middle of chi sentences. "Not now, son. Your father is speaking," she would say, trying to maintain some semblance of parental authority. Rio completed his story began, but Adaku, ever indulgent, would immediately rise from her chair. "Just a moment, my love. Show me what you've made." And Jill would shoot his father a triumphant look that seemed far too calculated for a child his age. The household staff weren't the only ones who noticed the strangeness growing like shadows at sunset. Mama A, Adaku's mother, arrived for a visit and was immediately struck by what she saw. The way Jill's eyes followed his mother's every movement. The way he positioned himself between Adaku and any male visitor. The way he seemed to mark his territory, like a creature far older than his years. "This is not right." Mama A confronted her daughter in the kitchen one afternoon, her voice low but urgent. "The way you shower with him, the way you let him sleep in your bed, it's not innocent anymore. Can't you see what's happening?" But Adaku's defenses, built over years of protecting her miracle child, were impenetrable. "He's just a boy, Mama. He doesn't even understand such things. Why must everyone try to twist something pure into something ugly?" What Adaku couldn't or wouldn't see was how her son's behavior at school had begun to raise alarming flags. Male teachers reported his defiance, his challenging stares, his barely contained aggression. Female teachers noted how he spoke about his mother, the possessive pride in his voice when he declared, "My mama is the most beautiful woman in the world. No one else can compare." The school counselor tried to schedule a meeting with both parents, but Adaku intercepted the letter before Chi could see it. "They just don't understand him," she told herself. "They are jealous of our special bond." Then came the incident with Mr. Oko, their neighbor. A harmless compliment about Adaku's appearance transformed Jill into something unrecognizable. A creature of pure rage, hands clenched into fists, eyes blazing with a possessive fury that shocked everyone present. As he shoved the older man against the wall, screaming threats that no 15-year-old should even know, the facade of normalcy that Adaku had carefully maintained began to crack. But even then, she found ways to rationalize, to excuse, to deny. "He's just protective," she would say, her voice trembling slightly. "He's going through a phase. All teenagers are difficult." But she didn't say. What she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge was the fear that had begun to creep into her heart like frost on a window pane. The way Jill's eyes followed her now held something different, something that made her skin prickle with unease when she caught his reflection in mirrors. The flowers he brought her, once sweet gestures of filial love, now came with cards signed, "To my queen," in handwriting that seemed to tremble with barely contained emotion. At night, when the house was quiet except for the whisper of secrets in its walls, Adaku would lie awake, Chi's warnings echoing in her mind. A mother's love should liberate, not imprison. But by then, the prison walls were already too high, built brick by brick with her own blind devotion, and she was as much a captive as her son. Little did she know, in Chill's room, by the dim light of a hidden lamp, pages were being filled with words that would soon shatter what remained of her carefully constructed world, words that would force her to face the monster she had created, a monster born from the purest of intentions, nursed on the milk of unconditional love, and grown strong in the shadow of denial. The discovery of the notebook marked the moment when Adaku's carefully constructed reality began to crumble. She had been tidying Jill's room, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere, when her hand brushed against the leather-bound journal tucked between his mattress and bed frame. Later, she would remember how the air seemed to thicken as she opened it, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "My queen," the first page read, in handwriting that was both familiar and strange. "No one understands our love. They try to separate us, but they can't. They won't." The words became more fevered as she turned the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. Plans, fantasies, dark musings about removing obstacles, namely his father, from their path. Adaku's hands trembled as she read, her mind trying desperately to reject what her eyes were seeing. "This isn't real," she told herself. "This is just teenage confusion. This will pass." But deep in her heart, in that secret place where truths too painful to acknowledge reside, she knew better. The confrontation, when it came, unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. The kitchen was filled with the mundane sounds of dinner preparation, the soft bubbling of soup on the stove, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. Adaku felt Jill's presence before she saw him, a heavy weight in the air that made her shoulders tense. "Mama," he said, his voice soft but charged with something that made her pulse quicken. "I need to tell you something." She sat at the dining table, ostensibly reading but alert to the undercurrent of tension. He had learned to read these moments, to sense when the strange dynamic between his wife and son was about to manifest in new and troubling ways. "I love you, Mama," Shio continued, his eyes fever bright. Not like a son should love his mother. I love you like a man loves a woman. You are the only one for me. You always have been. The knife Adaku had been holding clattered to the counter. In that moment, she saw with terrible clarity every mistake, every boundary crossed, every warning ignored. The monster she had created with her own blind love stood before her, wearing her son's face, but expressing desires that made her blood run cold. She whispered, backing away. You don't know what you're saying. This isn't right. But Jill moved closer, his expression shifting from vulnerability to something darker. Don't pretend you haven't felt it too, he insisted, his voice rising. All those times we bathed together, slept together, the way you looked at me. Don't! Edaku's voice cracked like a whip. I'm your mother! The rejection transformed him. Gone was the sweet boy who had once brought her flowers. In his place stood something twisted by years of unhealthy attachment and blurred boundaries. He lunged forward, grabbing her arm with bruising force. She moved with a speed that belied his years, crossing the kitchen in 2 strides. Let her go, he roared, pulling Jill away from his mother. The struggle that followed was brief but violent. Jill, consumed by rage and thwarted desire, fought like a wild thing against his father's restraining grip. She's mine, he screamed. You've always tried to keep us apart. She loves me, not you. When the police arrived, summoned by Chi's desperate call, they found a scene of domestic devastation. The kitchen was in shambles, evidence of the struggle written in overturned chairs and broken dishes. Adaku sat huddled in a corner, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of her culpability crashed over her. The officers led Jill away in handcuffs, his last words echoing through the house. This is your fault, Mama. You made me love you like this. In the aftermath, as silence settled over the broken household, Chi and Adaku sat in their living room like survivors of a natural disaster, surrounded by the wreckage of their family life. The growing darkness outside seemed to seep into the room, matching the shadows in their hearts. I warned you, Chi said finally, his voice heavy with years of unheeded cautions. I begged you to see what was happening. Adaku couldn't respond. Her mind was trapped in an endless loop of memories. Every inappropriate touch she had allowed, every boundary she had failed to establish, every warning signs she had willfully ignored. The price of her blind love was now being paid in full, and the currency was her son's sanity and her family's peace. As night fell over the neighborhood, curious neighbors peeked through their curtains at the police car's retreating lights. Inside the house, Adaku and Chi remained frozen in their respective positions, each lost in their own thoughts about how their family had arrived at this point. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to mock them, marking time in a world that would never be the same. In her darker moments of reflection, Adaku would come to understand that love, when unchecked and unguided, could become as destructive as hate. She had thought she was protecting her son, nurturing him, giving him everything she had been denied during her years of barrenness. Instead, she had created a perversion of the mother-son bond that would haunt them all for years to come. The story spread through the community like wildfire, becoming a cautionary tale whispered among mothers at school gates and family gatherings. But for Adaku, locked in her private hell of guilt and regret, the true horror lay in knowing that she had been the architect of her own destruction, building it slowly, carefully, with each misguided act of love. Igbo strongly believes the blow to my family street before my time of death. In the days following Jill's arrest, the house on Cherry Street became a battlefield of competing solutions. Mama A arrived like a storm front, armed with phone numbers of pastors and prophecies of spiritual warfare. Chi, his face lined with exhaustion, advocated for psychiatric intervention, and Adaku, hollow-eyed and silent, drifted between them like a ghost, haunting the rooms where her son's presence still lingered. "This is not a matter for doctors," Mama A declared, her voice carrying the weight of generations of spiritual certainty. "This is a spiritual attack. The enemy has found a foothold through your excessive love, Adaku. We need deliverance." Pastor Nathan's church sat like a fortress on the outskirts of town, its white walls gleaming under the afternoon sun. Inside, the air was thick with incense and expectation. The pastor, a tall man with calculating eyes, took one look at Jill and began to prophesy. "This child," he intoned, his voice rising above the murmur of his congregation, "is cursed by a spiritual mother. The water spirits have claimed him as their own." His eyes fixed on Adaku with uncomfortable intensity. "You, mother, open the door through your excessive attachment. The price of deliverance will be high." The sum he named, 500,000, made Chi scoff, but Adaku was already reaching for her phone, fingers trembling as she made the transfer. Any price, she thought desperately. "I'll pay any price to fix this." But Jill stood unmoved through the prayers and prophecies, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and contempt. When Pastor Nathan approached him with holy water and declarations of spiritual warfare, Jill's response was swift and violent. The sound of ripping fabric filled the church as he tore the pastor's pristine white robe, his actions a mockery of the sacred ceremony. "You can't pray away what she created," he spat as security guards rushed to contain him. "This is who I am now." They tried other churches, other pastors, each one promising breakthrough, each one failing spectacularly. With every failed intervention, Jill's behavior grew more erratic, more possessive. He moved his belongings into Adaku's room, claiming territory like a conqueror, establishing dominion. "My son," Adaku pleaded one evening, her voice barely above a whisper, "why are you behaving like this? I'm your mother. You cannot have me. Don't you understand? It's an abomination." Giles' response chilled her to the bone. "If I can't have you, then no one will, Mama. The more you keep taking me to these churches, the more my hatred grows. Don't make me hate you." In quiet moments, when the weight of guilt threatened to crush her, Adaku would replay every moment that had led to this nightmare. "If I had known," she tortured herself, "I wouldn't have exposed my body to him. I wouldn't have showered with him. I should have drawn the lines." She watched his wife's suffering with a mixture of compassion and frustration. "I told you therapy was the answer," he said one night after another failed church intervention. "This isn't about spirits or curses. This is about years of inappropriate boundaries and emotional manipulation." But Nigerian apology of love translated into spell, and the next day from jail, only a poem of mightiest combination of secrets as they suffer from despair and struggle to live his life, fed by years of misplaced love and ignored warnings. When Jill finally crossed the last line, attempting to force himself on Adaku one dark night, the sound of her terrified screams echoed through the house like the final toll of a funeral bell. The police came again, this time with no hesitation about what needed to be done. As they led Jill away in handcuffs for the second time, His eyes never left his mother's face. In them, Adaku saw the reflection of every mistake she had made, every boundary she had failed to set, every warning she had ignored. Now the next phase came. Ebianet Openye Opiandio. 5 men who were 15. The cell door's clang was like a period at the end of a tragic sentence. Jill, once her miracle child, now sat in a concrete room, his love twisted into something unrecognizable. And Adaku, the mother who had loved too blindly, too completely, was left to face the consequences of her creation. Who, in the community, their story became a whispered warning, passed between mothers like a sacred cautionary tale. Did you hear about Adaku's son? They would murmur. That's what happens when a mother's love goes too far, but none of them could truly understand the complexity of the tragedy, how love, the purest of emotions, could become poison when administered without wisdom, how the very arms that were meant to protect could end up destroying what they held most dear. As night settled over the prison where Jill now resided, Adaku stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the moon. The same moon that had witnessed countless nights of her crossing boundaries that should have remained sacred. In the silvery light, she could almost see the ghost of what might have been. A healthy mother-son relationship, built on proper boundaries and wise love. But that ghost, like all others born of regret, could only haunt, never heal. The price of her blind love had been paid in full, and the currency was her son's future, her family's peace, and her own soul's quiet. Prison walls have a way of amplifying silence. In the sterile visiting room, Adaku sat across from her son, separated by thick glass and years of catastrophic choices. Jill's face, once soft with childhood innocence, had hardened into something unrecognizable in the harsh fluorescent lighting. 3 months had passed since his imprisonment, but the obsession in his eyes burned as bright as ever. "Have you come to take me home, Mama?" His voice crackled through the phone receiver, a distorted version of the sweet boy who once brought her flowers. "I've learnt my lesson. I'll be good now." But they both knew the lies beneath those words. The notebook they'd found in his cell last week, smuggled in and filled with more disturbing fantasies, told a different story. The psychiatrist assigned to his case had used terms like pathological attachment and audible fixation, clinical phrases that couldn't capture the magnitude of their tragedy. Back at home, Chiwe had begun the painful process of rebuilding their shattered life. He'd cleared out Jill's room, packing away the evidence of their failures into cardboard boxes, labeled simply J. Each item told its own story of warning signs missed. Photographs where Jill's possessive embrace of his mother should have raised alarms. School reports noting his aggressive behavior toward male teachers. The collection of poetry he'd written about his queen. "We need to talk about what happens next," Chi said one evening, watching Adaku's listless form on the sofa. She had taken to spending hours there, staring at nothing, lost in the labyrinth of her memories. "The doctors say it needs long-term institutional care." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Mama A, who had temporarily moved in to help manage the crisis, crossed herself and muttered prayers under her breath. She had finally abandoned her insistence on spiritual solutions after the last pastor's visit to the prison ended, with Jill attempting to attack him. "It's beyond prayers now," she had admitted, her voice heavy with defeat. "Sometimes the demons we create are stronger than the ones that come from outside." The neighborhood had developed its own rhythm of whispers and sideways glances. Women pulled their children closer when Adaku passed by, as if her tragedy might be contagious. The story had evolved in its telling, each version more sensational than the last. but none as devastating as the truth. Nights were the worst. In the darkness, Adaku would hear phantom footsteps in the hallway, echoes of Jill's childhood trips to her bedroom. "Mama, I'm scared," he would say then, climbing into her bed. She had never once turned him away, never once said no. Now, in the cruel clarity of hindsight, she understood how each such moment had been a break in the foundation of his obsession. The prison psychiatrist had requested a meeting with both parents. "We need to understand the root causes," she explained, her office a stark contrast to the chaos of their lives. This level of attachment disorder doesn't develop overnight. As she flipped through her notes, each observation was like a knife to Adaku's heart. The shed baths that continued far too long, the co-sleeping well into adolescence, the lack of boundaries, the dismissed concerns from teachers and family members, a perfect storm of misguided love and willful blindness. "What happens now?" Chi'i asked, his hand resting protectively on Adaku's shoulder. The psychiatrist's response was measured but clear. "Your son needs intensive therapy, but more importantly, you both need to understand that the Jill you knew, the son you hoped for during those 10 years of waiting, may never have truly existed. What you saw as miracle and blessing became distorted into something else entirely." Outside the prison, life continued its relentless forward march. Seasons changed, neighbors' children grew, and new stories replaced theirs in the community's gossip chain. But for the family in the house on Cherry Street, time seemed frozen in the moment of Jill's final arrest. Adaku had taken to writing letters, not to Jill, but to her younger self. Letters warning of the dangers of love without limits, of devotion without boundaries, of worship without wisdom. Letters that would never be sent, but needed to be written. "Dear past me," one begins, "a mother's love should be like a garden wall, high enough to protect, but never so high that it blocks out the sun. I built a fortress instead, and in its shadows, something dark took root." As part one of their story drew to a close, questions lingered like ghosts in the corners of their home. Could Jill ever be rehabilitated? Would Adaku ever forgive herself? Could a family shattered by its own love ever find its way back to wholeness? The answers lay waiting in the future, but one truth had emerged from the wreckage of their past. Love, when twisted by obsession and unchecked by wisdom, could become the most dangerous force of all. And sometimes, the monsters we fear most are the ones we create with our own hands, fed by our deepest desires and nurtured by our blindest devotion. To be continued in part 2.